The first thing I noticed wasn't the fence. It was the sign. A bright yellow board bolted to the front gate of my ranch that read, "Abandoned property, under HOA recovery." I had been gone 8 months on deployment. 8 months. When I left, the ranch gate was an old wooden swing gate my grandfather built 30 years ago. Now there was a steel keypad gate, construction tape stretched along the fence line, and survey stakes planted across my pasture like someone had started dividing the land. A bulldozer sat near the creek, engine idling. I parked the truck and walked up to the gate slowly. A contractor wearing a safety vest looked up from his clipboard. He barely glanced at me before saying, "Development starts today. Phase 4 subdivision." Then he pointed to another sign behind the fence. "Cedar Ridge Community Expansion. 40 residential lots. Right across my ranch." I pulled a folded letter from the mailbox that had been jammed into the fence. It had the Cedar Ridge HOA letterhead. Inside was a notice stating my property had been officially marked abandoned after months of noncompliance. Below that was the number that made the contractor look confident. $137,900 in penalties and recovery fees. And at the bottom of the page, the HOA president had written a note in blue ink. "Military service doesn't excuse neglect. The community can't wait forever." I read the letter again, calmly, because if they had really declared my ranch abandoned, that meant they had filed something with the county. And if they filed it wrong, then the 40 houses they were about to build might not belong to the HOA at all. So I folded the letter, looked back at the bulldozer, and asked the contractor one quiet question. Who filed the abandonment notice? Because if the wrong office processed it, this entire development might be illegal. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy real stories where patience and the law beat arrogance. Because the HOA thought they had already taken my ranch. They had the paperwork. They had the contractors. What they didn't realize was that one document could bring the entire project to a stop. My name is Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer, U.S. Army Logistics. I've spent most of my adult life moving equipment, fuel, and people through systems that only work when every detail is tracked and documented. That habit followed me home. The ranch sitting behind that new steel gate isn't a luxury property. It's 38 acres of quiet pasture, a small creek running through the center, and a weathered ranch house my grandfather built with his own hands. My grandfather bought the land long before this area started growing. Back then it was just farmland and dirt roads. When he passed, the property came to me. Most people asked why I kept it when I was in the Army and rarely home. The answer was simple. The ranch wasn't just land. It was the one place that hadn't changed since I was a kid. Even when deployments pulled me halfway across the world, I knew that when I came back, that stretch of pasture and the creek behind the house would still be there. For years, it was. But about 4 years ago, things around the ranch started shifting. Developers began buying farmland nearby. Within 2 years, a planned community appeared on the north side of my property. Then another one on the east side. Eventually, the developments connected into a single neighborhood called Cedar Ridge. And with it came the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. At first, they didn't have any authority over my land. My ranch had been there decades before the HOA ever existed. But the community ended up surrounding my property on 3 sides, and that's when the letters started arriving. They were polite at first. Requests asking if I'd consider selling the land so the neighborhood could expand naturally. Invitations to join the HOA voluntarily. Offers from a development company that worked closely with the board. Each one was signed by the HOA president, Linda Harwood, former real estate broker. Very organized. Very persistent. Every time, my answer was the same. The ranch isn't for sale. After the 3rd letter, the offer stopped. But something else started. Surveyors began walking along the outer fence line. Developers bought farmland directly behind my pasture. And Cedar Ridge quietly updated the community map that appeared on their website. On that map, my ranch sat directly in the center of what they labeled future expansion zone. Then my last deployment orders arrived. 8 months overseas. Before leaving, I did what soldiers always do. I prepared. Property taxes paid early. Mail forwarding arranged. Security cameras placed at the gate. Every document organized in a folder. Because in the Army you learn something quickly. Systems only fail when someone stops paying attention. What I didn't know when I left was that while I was gone, someone at Cedar Ridge decided my ranch had become abandoned property. And they were ready to act on it. I called the Cedar Ridge HOA office the same afternoon I found the sign on my gate. The receptionist transferred me almost immediately. Cedar Ridge Administration, this is Linda Harwood. Her voice sounded calm. Polished. Like she had already had this conversation before. Daniel Mercer, I said. Owner of the ranch at the south boundary. There was a short pause. Then she responded in the same controlled tone. Yes, Sergeant Mercer. We've been expecting to hear from you. Expecting. That word told me a lot. Linda began explaining the situation like she was reading from a prepared script. According to Cedar Ridge bylaws, properties that showed extended neglect, noncompliance, and lack of owner contact could be declared abandoned under a board recovery provision. She listed the timeline. 3 written notices. Multiple inspection reports. And finally a unanimous board vote declaring the property abandoned so it could be recovered for community development. I let her finish. Then I asked the first question that mattered. Where were the notices sent? To the property address, she said immediately. Certified mail. Of course they were. My ranch mailbox had been locked while I was deployed. Which meant every notice sat there untouched until someone from the HOA decided that silence meant abandonment. Linda continued speaking like the process was already finished. The board had already approved development access. Contractors had already been scheduled. And the fees listed in the letter were now officially attached to the property. She read the breakdown like it was an invoice. Missed HOA dues. Accumulated penalties. Administrative recovery costs. Projected site preparation fees. Total balance owed. $137,900. Then she added something that sounded less like procedure and more like a lecture. Military service is admirable, Sergeant Mercer. But property ownership still carries responsibilities. The community can't pause progress forever. I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. I just asked the one question she clearly didn't expect. Which county office approved your abandonment filing? Another pause. Longer this time. Then she answered confidently. The county clerk recorded it last month. That evening I drove to the county building and asked the clerk for the filing. She found it within minutes and slid the document across the counter. At first glance it looked official. Stamped. Recorded. Signed. But something near the bottom caught my attention. Not the signatures. Not the date. The classification code attached to the filing. I read it twice. Then a third time. The clerk noticed me staring. Everything all right? She asked. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I said. I just need a certified copy. Because that code didn't match the process Linda Harwood described. And if the HOA filed the wrong classification with the county, then the authority they thought they had over my ranch might not exist at all. The next morning I met with a local property attorney named Mark Ellison. He had handled land disputes in the county for years, mostly arguments between farmers, developers, and zoning boards. When I placed the abandonment filing on his desk, he read it carefully without saying anything for almost 2 minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair. On the surface, he said, tapping the document, this looks legitimate. That wasn't surprising. HOAs survive on paperwork. They rarely make mistakes in the obvious places. But I pointed to the classification code printed near the county stamp. That part doesn't match what she described. Mark studied it again. His eyebrows narrowed slightly. You're right, he said quietly. That code isn't usually used for HOA recovery filings. But it still wasn't enough to stop anything immediately. So Mark recommended we do something simple first. We asked questions. Officially. Within hours he drafted a letter addressed to Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association requesting several documents. The official board vote authorizing the abandonment declaration. The HOA bylaw clause used to justify the action. Proof of certified mail delivery for the 3 notices they claimed to send. Any county approvals related to the filing. The request was professional. No accusations. Just clarification. Cedar Ridge responded quickly. Too quickly. 2 days later a thick envelope arrived containing copies of everything. Board meeting minutes showing a unanimous vote. Certified mail receipts addressed to my ranch mailbox. Inspection reports claiming the property appeared unmaintained. Even a timeline documenting when the board began discussing recovery. On paper, it all looked organized. Almost polished. But Mark noticed something else while reviewing it. They moved fast, he said. Too fast. From the first inspection to the abandonment declaration, the HOA completed the entire process in just over 3 months. Most recovery actions took twice that long. Meanwhile, construction activity on my ranch was accelerating. Surveyors started planting more stakes across the pasture. A grading crew arrived to mark the path for a future access road. Temporary fencing appeared near the creek. Every day new equipment showed up. I documented everything. Photos. Dates. Contractor company names printed on the trucks. Mark kept building a file. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. A week later another letter arrived. This one labeled Final Liability Update. According to Cedar Ridge, because I had interfered with community development activities, additional penalties had been added. Administrative enforcement fee. Contractor delay fee. Community impact surcharge. The total balance increased again. $147,300. At the bottom of the notice was a warning printed in bold text. Failure to resolve outstanding liabilities may result in lien enforcement and forced property auction under HOA authority. Mark read the letter and sighed. They're pushing pressure, he said. Which made sense. Once developers start preparing land, every delay costs money. The HOA needed this issue resolved quickly. Preferably before anyone questioned the paperwork. But the more we reviewed their documents, the stranger the county filing classification looked. So Mark asked the county office to confirm something. Was anything else filed with this record? He asked. The clerk searched through the database again. No additional filings, she said. Which meant Cedar Ridge had submitted exactly one document to justify taking control of my ranch. Just one. And it still carried the wrong classification code. That same week another letter arrived from the HOA. This one wasn't about penalties. It was an invitation. The Cedar Ridge Board would be holding a community meeting to discuss the future development of Phase 4. And they specifically requested my presence. Mark read the notice and shook his head. They're confident, he said. Confident enough to discuss the project publicly. Confident enough to show the community what they believed was already theirs. But if they had built their entire plan on the wrong legal filing, then the moment that meeting started, Cedar Ridge might be presenting a project they didn't actually have the authority to build. And the board had no idea yet. The Cedar Ridge Community Hall was already full when I arrived. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, most of them occupied by residents curious about the neighborhood's next expansion. At the front, a large projector screen displayed a detailed development map. Bright green blocks marked future housing lots. And right in the center of the map was my ranch. Except it wasn't labeled as a ranch anymore. Across the pasture area someone had typed a new title in bold letters. Phase 4, Cedar Ridge Expansion. 40 residential lots. A paved access road cutting through the middle of the pasture. And a small park planned along the creek. Linda Harwood stood near the screen speaking to the audience like a real estate presentation. Her voice was smooth and confident. Cedar Ridge has grown steadily over the past 5 years, she explained. Phase 4 will allow our community to continue expanding while improving property values for everyone. She tapped a laser pointer against the map. Several residents nodded as she highlighted the road layout. Then she pointed to the center of the projection. My ranch. Except she didn't call it that. This land, she said, was determined to be abandoned property after extended neglect. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Someone in the audience raised a hand. Wasn't the owner deployed with the Army? Linda answered immediately, her tone still professional. Military service is honorable, she said. But property ownership still carries responsibilities. She paused just long enough for the statement to land. Cedar Ridge followed the legal process required under community bylaws. A few people glanced back toward me. I was sitting near the back row. Not speaking. Just listening. Linda continued walking through the development projections. Projected home prices. Estimated HOA revenue increase. Construction timeline. According to her presentation, Phase 4 would generate more than $6 million in property value for the neighborhood. Everything about the presentation suggested the project was already approved and inevitable. By the time the meeting reached the public comment section, the room felt convinced. Linda looked toward the back of the room. Sergeant Mercer, she said politely. You're welcome to address the board if you'd like. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I stood up slowly. I'm still reviewing the county filing, I said calmly. Linda smiled, the kind of polite smile people use when they believe the argument is already over. The county already recorded the abandonment notice, she replied. That part of the process is complete. Several residents nodded as if that statement settled everything. To most people in the room, a county stamp meant the issue was finished. But I didn't argue. I just wrote something in my notebook and sat back down. The meeting ended with applause from a group of developers standing near the door. For them, Phase 4 looked like guaranteed profit. Outside the hall, Mark caught up with me near the parking lot. They're moving fast, he said. I nodded. They think it's already done. And for the first time since the bulldozers showed up at my ranch, it really did look that way. 2 weeks later, Cedar Ridge filed another document with the county. One that gave the HOA something far more powerful than a presentation slide. They filed a property lien. Which meant if nothing stopped them soon, my ranch could legally be auctioned to pay the debt they claimed I owed. And from the outside, it looked like the HOA had finally locked the door on any way back. That night the ranch was quiet again. The construction crews had left before sunset, but the marks they left behind were everywhere. Survey flags fluttered in the evening wind. Fresh tire tracks cut through the grass near the creek. And the bulldozer sat parked beside the temporary fence like it belonged there. I sat on the old wooden porch of the ranch house, the same porch my grandfather built years ago. For the first time since I returned home, the weight of everything started to settle in. In the Army, problems usually come with clear lines. Orders. Procedures. Chains of command. But this fight didn't feel like that. This was paperwork. Slow, complicated, and designed to make people give up before they understood it. I opened the folder Mark and I had been building. Photos of the construction equipment. Copies of the HOA letters. The county filing. The lien notice. Every page carefully organized. The number on the lien document still sat there like a warning. $147,300. If Cedar Ridge pushed the auction through, the developers waiting behind them could buy the land for a fraction of its real value. 40 houses. Millions in profit. And the ranch my grandfather built would disappear under concrete roads and cul-de-sacs. For a moment I wondered if the board expected exactly this. That eventually the pressure would work. That I'd get tired of the legal fight. Pay something. Or walk away. But the more I thought about it, the more one detail kept bothering me. That classification code on the county filing. It didn't belong in an HOA abandonment process. Not even close. Which meant one of two things had happened. Either Cedar Ridge made a mistake when they filed it, or they used a process they didn't fully understand. I closed the folder and stared out across the pasture again. There's something you learn after enough time in the Army. When a system looks complicated, most people assume it's stronger than it actually is. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the system only works because nobody checks the details. The next morning I drove back to the county office. This time I wasn't asking about the abandonment filing. I asked the clerk for something much older. A record tied to the original land survey on my ranch. She started searching through the archive system. Then she paused and looked back at me. Are you sure that's the document you want? Because if that record still existed, it might explain why Cedar Ridge used the wrong filing code in the first place. 2 days after the community meeting, Cedar Ridge made their next move. And this time they didn't announce it at a board meeting. They filed it quietly with the county. The notice arrived in my mailbox early that morning. A property lien enforcement filing. The HOA had officially attached the claimed balance to my ranch. Mark read through the document slowly while I sat across from his desk. They're escalating, he said. According to the filing, Cedar Ridge now claimed the following: missed HOA dues, accumulated penalties, administrative recovery costs, construction delay damages. The updated total sat in bold type across the bottom of the page. $147,300. But the number wasn't the real problem. The timeline was. Under the HOA's enforcement clause, if the debt wasn't resolved within 30 days, the board could request a court-approved property auction, which meant the land could legally be sold to recover the claimed balance. And developers were already waiting. Outside the ranch, the construction activity intensified. The grading crew began cutting a narrow path across the pasture where the future access road would run. Survey markers appeared every few yards. A temporary sign was planted beside the gate. Future site of Cedar Ridge, Phase 4. Neighbors driving past slowed down to look. Some probably assumed the project was already decided. From the outside, it looked that way. The HOA had paperwork. They had contractors. They had a lien filed with the county. Even Mark admitted the pressure was real. If the lien holds, he said, they'll try to force this into court quickly. And courts tend to move fast when liens are involved. Which meant Cedar Ridge might succeed before we proved anything was wrong. For the first time since this started, the situation looked like it might actually slip out of reach. 30 days. That was the clock Cedar Ridge believed they had put on my ranch. But the following afternoon, the county clerk called Mark's office. She said she had found the older document we requested in the archives. And after reviewing it, she wanted us to come back to the county office immediately, because the record connected directly to the filing code Cedar Ridge used. And if the connection was what she believed it was, then the lien the HOA had just filed might not survive the week. The county records office sat in the basement of the courthouse. Rows of old filing cabinets lined the walls, most of them filled with land surveys, easements, and agricultural records that dated back decades. When Mark and I arrived, the clerk was already waiting at the counter with a thin folder in her hands. I pulled the archive file you asked about, she said. She slid the folder across the desk. Inside was a document tied to the original survey of my ranch property. The paper itself looked old, the edges slightly yellowed. At the top was the year it had been recorded. 1994. I read through it once. Then again. Mark leaned closer as he realized what we were looking at. This explains the classification code, he said quietly. The document wasn't an HOA filing. It wasn't even related to neighborhood development. It was a federal agricultural conservation designation attached to the creek that ran through the center of my ranch. Years earlier, my grandfather had enrolled a portion of the land in a federal conservation program designed to protect natural waterways and prevent uncontrolled development. The program didn't affect daily use of the land. But it came with one very specific rule. Any property action that involved transferring control, altering ownership authority, or developing land within that corridor required federal review and approval first. I looked back at the abandonment filing Cedar Ridge had submitted. Then at the classification code printed beside the county stamp. The HOA hadn't used a normal abandonment code. They had filed under a category tied to land authority changes affecting protected easements. Which meant something important had just happened. The moment Cedar Ridge filed that document with the county, they triggered a legal process they clearly didn't understand. I looked up at the clerk. Did the HOA file the federal review notice that goes with this? She checked the system one more time. Then shook her head. No, she said. Mark leaned back slowly. Because if Cedar Ridge never filed the required federal notice, then the abandonment claim they built their entire development plan on might not just be wrong. It might be legally invalid. The moment the clerk said Cedar Ridge never filed the federal notice, the entire situation changed. Until that moment, the fight between me and the HOA had looked like a typical property dispute. HOA rules. County filings. Liens and penalties. But the document sitting on the clerk's desk wasn't part of any HOA system. It was part of a federal conservation program. Mark asked the clerk to print the full easement record. She pulled it from the archive database and placed the pages in front of us. The document explained everything clearly. Back in 1994, my grandfather had enrolled a portion of the ranch into a federal agricultural conservation corridor program. The program protected waterways and surrounding land from uncontrolled development. The small creek that ran through my pasture had been designated as part of that corridor. The enrollment didn't prevent farming or ranching, but it created one important legal condition. Any action involving development, ownership transfer authority, or property control changes affecting the designated area required federal review before approval. And the corridor didn't just include the water. It extended several hundred feet on both sides of the creek, which meant a large section of my ranch was tied to the program. Mark flipped through the HOA abandonment filing again. Then he laid it beside the easement record. Look here, he said. He pointed to the classification code printed next to the county recording stamp. That code wasn't normally used for HOA property disputes. It was used when a filing might affect land under conservation designation, which meant the moment Cedar Ridge submitted their abandonment declaration, the county system automatically flagged it as a potential federal oversight issue. The system was designed to prevent exactly the type of development the HOA had already started. But the system depended on one critical step. The party filing the claim had to submit a federal review notice. Cedar Ridge never did, which meant the filing process stopped halfway through the required legal chain. Mark explained it in simple terms. The county recorded their document, he said. But the moment they used that classification code, the process required federal review before anything else could happen. I looked back at the ranch development plans Linda had presented during the HOA meeting. 40 residential lots. A paved access road. A park near the creek. Every one of those plans crossed the protected corridor, which meant none of it could legally proceed without federal approval. And since the HOA never filed the required notice, their abandonment claim had never actually become valid. It had only looked official. Mark asked the clerk another question. Does the system show whether the federal office was notified automatically? She searched the database again, then shook her head. No automatic notice was generated, which meant the system assumed Cedar Ridge would file the federal review request themselves. When they didn't, the process simply stopped. But the HOA either didn't know that or assumed no one would check. Mark gathered the documents and nodded. Now we move this up the chain. Within hours, he sent copies of the easement record and the abandonment filing to the County Legal Review Office. He also included the development plan Cedar Ridge had publicly presented. 2 days later, the county contacted Cedar Ridge requesting clarification. 3 days after that, the situation escalated again. Because the county realized something the HOA hadn't. Cedar Ridge hadn't just skipped federal review. They had already allowed construction activity on land that might fall inside a protected conservation corridor, which meant the issue was no longer just about HOA authority. Now it involved federal land compliance regulations. The county forwarded the file to the Regional Federal Conservation Office responsible for oversight. When Linda Harwood received the notice, it wasn't from me. And it wasn't from my attorney. It came directly from the county. A formal request asking Cedar Ridge to explain why a development project had begun on land potentially protected under a federal conservation designation. The notice also asked for documentation proving the HOA had submitted the required federal review filing. Cedar Ridge couldn't provide it because they never filed it. The moment that became clear, the county issued an administrative pause order on the property. Construction activity was ordered to stop until the review was completed. Survey crews disappeared from the ranch within 2 days. The bulldozer that had been idling near the creek vanished by the end of the week. And Cedar Ridge suddenly stopped sending letters about penalties. Because the issue had moved far beyond the HOA boardroom. For the first time since this started, the system Cedar Ridge believed they controlled was now reviewing their actions instead. And the next step in that review would take place somewhere the HOA couldn't control. A formal county hearing, with federal representatives involved. And every document Cedar Ridge filed about my ranch sitting in front of them. The county hearing took place 3 weeks after construction stopped. By then, the situation had spread well beyond Cedar Ridge. Word travels quickly in a small county when a development project suddenly shuts down under federal review. The hearing room was larger than the HOA meeting hall where Linda Harwood had presented her Phase 4 expansion. But the tension in the room felt very different. This wasn't a community presentation. This was a formal county administrative review. At the front of the room sat the county land compliance officer and 2 members of the county legal department. A video screen on the wall connected the hearing to representatives from the Regional Federal Conservation Office. Linda Harwood sat with 2 other Cedar Ridge board members and an attorney hired by the HOA. Behind them were several developers who had planned to build the Phase 4 homes. Mark and I sat at the opposite table. The hearing began with a simple question from the county officer. When did Cedar Ridge file the abandonment declaration for the Mercer property? Linda answered first. Last month, she said. Following the procedures outlined in our HOA bylaws. The county officer nodded and looked down at the documents in front of him. And which classification code was used for the filing? Linda glanced toward the attorney beside her before answering. The code recommended by the clerk's office. The county officer lifted the document. That code is used when a filing may affect land under federal conservation designation. The room grew quiet. Linda's attorney leaned forward. The HOA followed standard abandonment procedure, he said. The federal designation was not identified during our review. The county officer turned slightly toward the screen where the federal representatives were watching. One of them spoke next. According to federal records, the representative said, the Mercer property contains a conservation corridor tied to the creek system running through the land. The screen displayed a map. A blue line representing the creek cut across my ranch. On both sides of that line, a wide shaded area marked the protected corridor. The federal representative continued. Any action altering development authority inside this corridor requires federal review prior to approval. The county officer nodded. And did Cedar Ridge submit that review request? Linda's attorney answered this time. We were not aware the corridor extended into the planned development area. The federal representative zoomed in on the map. The shaded corridor crossed directly through the center of the Phase 4 layout Linda had presented weeks earlier. It cut through the proposed road. It crossed several of the planned housing lots. And the park Cedar Ridge intended to build sat directly beside the protected creek. The federal representative spoke again. Our office did not receive a review request for this property. That sentence hung in the air for several seconds, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. The HOA had already allowed construction crews onto land they didn't legally control. The county officer looked back toward Linda. Did Cedar Ridge verify federal land designations before filing the abandonment declaration? Linda tried to keep her voice steady. Our board believed the property was not under active federal oversight. The county officer turned toward me. Sergeant Mercer, he said, when did you become aware of the conservation designation? When the county clerk retrieved the original easement record, I answered. Had you been notified of the HOA abandonment declaration before returning from deployment? No, I said. The notices were sent to my locked mailbox while I was overseas. Several people in the room exchanged glances. The county officer looked back at the documents. Then he asked the question that finally shifted the tone of the hearing. If the abandonment filing required federal review before becoming valid. He paused briefly. Then on what authority did Cedar Ridge begin development activity on the Mercer property? Linda didn't answer immediately. Her attorney leaned forward again. Our understanding was that the county recording validated the declaration. The county legal advisor finally spoke. The recording confirms the document was filed, he said. It does not confirm that the filing process was legally complete. He tapped the page containing the classification code. Once this code was used, federal review became a required step. The advisor looked up at the HOA board members. And that step never occurred. The room remained silent. Mark leaned slightly toward me. They just lost their foundation, he whispered. The county officer looked back toward the federal screen. Based on the documentation provided, does the federal office consider the abandonment declaration valid? The federal representative answered calmly. No. A few quiet gasps came from the back of the room. Because that one word changed everything Cedar Ridge had claimed. The county officer continued. If the abandonment declaration is invalid, then the lien filed against the property would also be affected. The legal advisor nodded. It would have no enforceable basis. The developers seated behind the HOA board shifted uncomfortably. Several of them began whispering to each other. Because the project they had already invested time and money into was now collapsing in real time. The county officer closed the folder in front of him. He looked once more toward Linda Harwood. Cedar Ridge attempted to exercise property authority that required federal review before approval. He paused before continuing, and allowed development activity to begin before that review occurred. Then he turned slightly toward me. Sergeant Mercer, he said, is there anything you'd like to add before we issue the ruling? I stood slowly. Every person in the room was watching. But I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly at the HOA board. You asked earlier why I questioned the filing, I said calmly. Linda didn't respond. I continued. Because the moment you used that classification code. I nodded toward the document on the table. This stopped being an HOA matter. The county officer leaned back in his chair. Because everyone in the room already understood what came next. The only thing left was the ruling that would decide how much of Cedar Ridge's authority survived the mistake they made. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after the federal representative said the abandonment declaration was invalid. No one at the Cedar Ridge table spoke. The developers sitting behind them stopped whispering. Because the situation had shifted from a complicated dispute to something much simpler. The foundation of the HOA's claim had just collapsed. The county land officer looked down at the documents again before continuing the hearing. Based on the federal conservation designation tied to the Mercer property, he said, any development or authority transfer affecting the protected corridor requires federal review prior to approval. He tapped the abandonment filing with his pen. That review never occurred. Linda Harwood's attorney tried to recover the situation. Our understanding was that the county recording validated the declaration, he said carefully. The county legal advisor responded immediately. The county recording confirms that a document was submitted, he said. It does not confirm that the filing process was legally complete. He slid another document across the table toward the HOA attorney. The classification code used in the filing automatically triggers federal oversight requirements. That step was never satisfied. Linda finally spoke. Our board acted in good faith, she said. We followed the procedures available to us. The federal representative on the screen answered calmly. Intent does not override federal compliance requirements. The county officer nodded slightly, which means the abandonment declaration cannot be considered valid. He paused briefly before continuing. And any lien based on that declaration cannot be enforced. The HOA attorney flipped through the documents again, clearly searching for something to argue. But there was nothing left to challenge. The lien existed only because the abandonment filing claimed the property had been legally recovered. Now that the filing itself had been invalidated, the lien had no foundation. The county officer continued reading from the review notes. Because development activity began before federal review was completed, Cedar Ridge will be required to cease all construction activity on the Mercer property immediately. He looked toward the developers seated behind the board. All equipment must be removed from the property within 10 business days. Several of the developers exchanged frustrated looks. Some of them had already spent money preparing the project. But the county officer wasn't finished. The county will also issue a corrective order removing the abandonment declaration from the Mercer property record. He turned a page. The lien filed against the property will be voided. Mark leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "That's the key line." Because without the lien, the HOA no longer had any leverage over the ranch. The officer continued. Cedar Ridge will also be responsible for reimbursing legal and administrative costs associated with the improper filing. Linda's shoulders tightened slightly when she heard that. But the final consequence came next. The county legal advisor spoke again. Because the filing used a classification that triggered federal oversight, the county will also conduct a compliance review of the HOA's administrative procedures. That meant Cedar Ridge's actions would be examined closely. How the filing happened. Who authorized it? Whether the board had verified the property records before attempting to take control of the land. It wasn't a criminal accusation. But it was a serious administrative investigation. The officer closed the folder in front of him. This ruling will be recorded with the county clerk and issued to both parties within 48 hours. Then he looked toward me. Sergeant Mercer, once the corrective filing is recorded, the property authority will remain entirely under your ownership. For the first time during the hearing, the outcome was clear. The lien was gone. The abandonment declaration was erased. And the HOA's development plan had no legal path forward. The developers behind the board began quietly gathering their documents. Without control of the ranch, the Phase 4 expansion map no longer worked. The access road they planned ran directly across land they had no authority to touch. The park they wanted to build sat inside the protected creek corridor. The entire project depended on land they could no longer claim. As people slowly stood up to leave the hearing room, Linda Harwood remained seated for a moment longer. The confidence she carried into the HOA meeting weeks earlier was gone. Not because anyone had shouted. Not because anyone had threatened her. But because the system she thought she controlled had simply followed its own rules. Mark collected the final copies of the hearing documents and placed them in our folder. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and the parking lot was nearly empty. The construction crews had already stopped work days earlier when the county issued the pause order. Now there would be no reason for them to come back. Mark closed the folder and looked at me. "Well," he said, "that's about as clean a reversal as you'll ever see." I looked down at the papers one more time. One filing mistake. One overlooked record in the county archive. That was all it had taken to stop a project worth millions. And now the land Cedar Ridge had already started dividing into 40 housing lots. Was going back to exactly what it had always been. My ranch. A month after the hearing, the ranch looked the way it had before all of this started. The construction equipment was gone. The temporary fencing had been removed. Even the tire tracks that once cut across the pasture had faded under new grass. The county ordered Cedar Ridge to void the abandonment declaration and remove the lien from my property record. The HOA was also required to reimburse the legal costs tied to the improper filing. Quietly, without much public discussion, Cedar Ridge held a new board election a few weeks later. Linda Harwood was no longer listed as president. The developers who had been waiting to build Phase 4 withdrew their plans. Without control of the ranch, the expansion map no longer made sense. One evening I walked down to the creek near the center of the property. The same creek my grandfather had protected decades earlier when he signed the conservation agreement. Back then, he probably never imagined it would matter much. But standing there now, watching the water move slowly through the grass, it was clear that one decision made years earlier had protected the land long after he was gone. Some systems take time to work. But when the right record is still in the archive, even the most confident paperwork can fall apart.